Thank you for joining us for One Community, Many Voices. The program will be starting soon at 6 o'clock. Welcome to One Community, Many Voices. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gil Preuss, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. I'm glad to be joined this evening by what will be over 450 people for an exciting night of Jewish learning in honor of Shavuot. For thousands of years, our ancestors have celebrated the gift of Torah by diving into the text and indulging in deep discussions, often into the wee hours of the morning. We won't be staying up all night, but we will be keeping the tradition alive with a full panel of scholars. It is a chance for us to appreciate the wisdom at the heart of our tradition. Before we get underway, I'd like to extend a deep thank you to Rabbi Uri Topolowski for taking the lead in organizing this event. Our partners, the Washington Board of Rabbis, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and Hadar have been instrumental in putting this evening together. And a special thank you goes out to all of tonight's teachers and all of you for joining. I hope that as we go through the evening, two things become very clear. First, Greater Washington is an incredible place to learn. This area is home to a wealth of stellar Jewish learning opportunities. I encourage you to reach out and follow up with as many rabbis as interest and pique your excitement and energy this evening. There are lots of classes and opportunities to learn, even during this time of quarantine. I am proud to share the incredible diversity of perspectives from across synagogues, community rabbis, and many others from across all different denominations tonight. Through this diversity comes our true strength. Tonight's event is but one example of the many ways our community is coming together in service of the greater whole. Tonight has been a truly collaborative effort, one we hope will be of value to every single person. The second is really about the incredible importance of Jewish wisdom today and in the future. Torah study unearths lessons about our fundamental values and how we can live up to them. It teaches us how to navigate the world and the challenges that come with it. It reminds us why living in community is so important. One of the most beautiful things about Judaism is that we are meant to bring our own perspectives and experiences to the sacred text. They don't live in isolation from who we are. In fact, they live in close, tight-knit connection with how we are living our lives and how we find meaning. Here in the United States, we are also observing Memorial Day. The themes of service, sacrifice, and honoring the past will take center stage this evening. And so before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to honor all those people who have served this country, all those people who have lost their lives in that service, all the people who have lost their lives during this terrible pandemic that we're in the middle of, and all those who continue to serve each and every day, those on the front lines and those essential workers who are helping us lead our lives. Finally, I would like to acknowledge all of the synagogues, agencies, and Jewish organizations across Greater Washington who have been working overtime to serve our community. From online programming to spiritual counseling, to providing food and cash assistance to those in need, so many people have stepped up to care for our community. Federation is proud to work alongside you in this effort, continuing to make emergency grant allocations to ensure that our community can provide crucial services. This includes setting aside discretionary funds for rabbis to help those in need throughout the community. We are in this together. We're in this for the long haul, and we will all be doing our best to find moments of joy and celebration along the way. So glad that tonight can be one of them. With that, I'm happy to hand things off to Rabbi Uri Topolowski. Uri.
Shalom, friends. Gil, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege, and just so thankful to partner with Jewish Federation and with you, Gil, who you have shown how much you care about investing in Jewish education for our community in so many different ways. And tonight we get to showcase so many wonderful rabbis throughout the community who have so much to teach and share. So many of my colleagues. I had wanted this to be a 6-hour webinar, a 9-hour webinar. I pitched many ideas so that we could include as many voices as possible. But this will be a wonderful treat for us tonight to hear from 16 rabbis in the community. And I thank our partners, the Board of Rabbis, Hadar, and of course, Jewish Federation, and a shout out to the Beltway Vad, who originated this idea that we got to bring forward. So I wanted to share just a little teaching as we kick off this webinar of learning, and to think about the fact that we are in a period of counting from Passover to Shavuot, which is traditionally called the Omer period, Sfirat HaOmer. We count 7 weeks until between Pesach and Shavuot. But the truth of the matter is that we're counting much more than just Pesach to Shavuot. Most of us have been counting from Purim to Shavuot, counting weeks and days during this pandemic. And that counting each day has brought a tremendous amount of uncertainty uncertainty when we were going to close, uncertainty when we should open, uncertainty if we can go to stores, uncertainty in so many different parts of our lives. The uncertainty has been disrupting the normal order of our lives. It's been disrupting even the most deeply held convictions that we have. A friend of mine said to me that they feel like they're surviving but not thriving. That's a powerful idea. We're surviving but not thriving. And I wonder if perhaps if we could train ourselves, if we could learn to embrace uncertainty itself as a value rather than a foe to overcome. If we could embrace uncertainty, perhaps there is a way to not only survive in times like this and in other challenges that we'll face, but also to thrive. Sir Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said once that faith is the courage to pioneer something new. Faith is the courage to pioneer something new. Think about that on so many different levels. I sing the song, Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash, sing to God a new song. And this idea is at the core, the fabric of our Torah. Lech Lecha, God says to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham, our forefather, go, leave everything you know. Leave it all behind. Start something new. How much uncertainty is there in newness? How much? And yet, this is the beginning of our faith. Or you think of the phrase from Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah the prophet, Lechtech acharai bamidbar be'eretz lo zarua. The Jewish people are praised for going after God into the desert, to the wilderness, to a land that is not sown, to take chances, to take a risk. Sure, we heard voices, people said, let's go back to what we know, even though it was slavery in Egypt. Passover says, no, let's take a risk. Let's try something new, even though it is so uncertain. And these are the days and weeks we are counting now. Counting to Shavuot. Shavuot, one of the texts we read is the book of Ruth. And just to say a brief word about our heroine, Ruth is told, stay here when her husband passed. Stay here. Go back to your family. But she says to her mother-in-law, I want to come with you. El asher techi elech. Where you go, I will go. I don't even know where that is. I've never been there. Uva asher talini alin. Where you sleep, I'll sleep. I've never stayed in that house, but I'll go anyway. The rabbis and the commentaries point out, the text says that they're going to return to Israel. But Ruth never was there to begin with to return, and it repeats it twice in the same verse. And the rabbis say this to show that this was quite a risk, tremendous uncertainty. Amech ami, your people will be my people, even though I don't know them. Velohayach Elohai, and your God will be my God. Wow, what a statement of embracing uncertain times, unpredictable set of events in Ruth's life that she's willing to grab a hold of, to embrace and believe and know that good things will come from it. Brene Brown teaches us to lean into the uncertainty. I've heard that phrase quoted so many times in her name. Lean into the uncertainty. Why? Because what are the things that we love so much that are only found in the uncertainty? Love, trust, friendship. These are things that are uncertain, but they are the bedrock of our relationships. They are the bedrock of our communication. They are the bedrock of our society. And most profoundly, they are the bedrock of our faith. Now, I was just thinking about this beautiful program tonight. Rabbis from all denominations, across the spectrum, different ideas, different communities. It takes a little bit of risk-taking to jump into the sea together and want to learn from each other, to want to share a space together, not just to want, but to desire it, to be excited by it, to be uncertain how the Zoom is going to work or how the Torah is going to work, but to jump in there, to embrace that uncertainty is a value. It's a value, and it helps us not just survive, but to thrive in these times. And I want to end with just one little teaching, which I share so often in my own community, but for me is at the core of what we're about to experience this Shavuot, this holiday, this coming weekend. And that is, Shavuot is our day traditionally to remember the Sinaitic revelation, the moment of standing as a people at Sinai and beholding the glory of Hashem, of God. Wow. If there's anything certain, wouldn't that be it? But the rabbis say that that's not how we experience the divine moving forward. You see, Elijah the prophet, he thought, let's try to continue to get people to experience the Sinaitic revelation. That'll inspire the masses. That'll keep us all connected. And so he set up a wild display of God's miraculous ways on a mountaintop, like Sinai, Har Carmel. And he set up an offering and brought down a fire from the heavens. After he had poured water all over it, after he had mocked the other prophets of Baal, of idolatrous worshipers who tried to bring their own offering and failed. And a fireball comes down from heaven and consumes his altar, and it should have been obvious, miraculous. This is the divine. And yet, the people don't hold on to that faith for too long. Miracles are not what bind us in our faith, in our connection. And so God appears to Elijah as he is sad and says to him, in my final minute, this beautiful teaching, says to him, Elijah, God is not found in the fireball that comes down, or the wind crashing, the thunder roaring, the mountain shaking. That's not where you're going to experience day in and day out, week in and week out as we count the presence of the divine. Instead, you will hear it in the kol d'mama daka, the thin, still sound. The sound of silence, the sound of uncertainty, the sound of, I'm not so sure, but that's where I find my connection. Let us experience the revelation of Shavuot in the kol d'mama daka, in the uncertain spaces, and build our connections with each other. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.
Rabbi Sue Shankman, I am excited to share the context of this day in which we are observing and in which we are studying together, as we're not quite to Shavuot, and today, as we know, is Memorial Day. As I begin, I just want to share that there is a text handout that was shared on the events program page, and if you would like to follow along the text or to see the fuller text, I won't be able to get into all of them in the amount of time, but I invite you to follow along or just to listen. So Memorial Day, while a secular American holiday, is infused with sacred connections for us as Jews. We understand the importance of remembering. The word Zachor is used almost 200 times in the Tanakh, and we know of the importance and power of memory in Jewish tradition. That word Zachor, we pause to remember throughout the Jewish year. We remember loved ones through the service of Yizkor, through the time that we set aside to remember, to recite names, to remember more than just names. Rosh Hashanah is also referred to as Yom HaZikaron, a day of memory, not to be confused with Yom HaZikaron that we observe for those fallen soldiers of the state of Israel. We're commanded to remember through our festivals and holidays in which the concept of memory is embedded both within the text as part of the instruction and reminder to maintain our observance. So one of the early places we see that word zachor is in Exodus in chapter 13, verse 3. We remember these words because we just recited them a little over a month ago. When Moses said to the people, Zachor et yom hazeh, remember this day on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, how Adonai freed you, and from it with a mighty hand, and no leavened bread shall be eaten. So instructions to remember the day and some observance that goes along with it. Each week we remember that idea of Zachor because we know it is rooted so closely and connected to our weekly holiday of Shabbat. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, something we strive to do each and every week. In fact, the medieval commentator Rashi takes it a lot farther, and if you would like to, you can look at his commentary on that verse. He takes it a lot, makes a lot longer out of just that one short verse. He talks about Zachor in that first place in Exodus, we remember the Sabbath day, and Shamor, the word guard or keep, that is used in the Deuteronomy description of the mitzvah to Shamor at Yom HaShabbat, to keep the Sabbath day. So this idea of remembering is not just in our minds, but it's what we do as well. That idea of Zachor works into our daily practice as well. We remember as we even put on our talis, our tzitzit. In the book of Numbers, in chapter 15, verses 39 and 40, that shall be the fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of Adonai and observe them. We remember that. Thus you shall be reminded to observe all my commandments and to be holy to your God. So it's not only in the holidays and the festivals, but also in what we do on a daily basis. And then more generally, we're taught the importance of not only continuing to remember, but also teaching that, l'dor vador, from one generation to the next, as we're taught in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 4, verse 9. Take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children. Not just the remembering, but ensuring that we don't forget. And how do we remember? We do so by teaching the next generation, telling them what we've seen, and making sure that they take that on as their own. In addition, a chapter later, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, Adonai your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Week in and week out, we are commanded to remember. Even on a daily basis, we have prayers that remind us that we were slaves and that we were taken from that slavery to freedom, and that along with memory is an obligation to do and to continue as a people. Before Passover, and Rabbi Topolowski referred to this, on Shabbat Zachor before Purim, we're reminded to remember Amalek, our people's greatest enemy in biblical times. So even before we get to Passover, at Shabbat Zachor, we are reminded in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19, to remember what Amalek did to you on your journey. We must remember our enemies, and to remember as well, not just the idea that we keep with us this idea of what Amalek did and the terrible and horrifying things of that experience for our people, but to blot out his name, and that we should not forget, even as we blot out the memory of Amalek from the world, from under heaven, we must remember. We must not forget what Amalek did to us. It's an important reminder in terms of how we treat others as well. And finally, on a more general level, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7, remember, Zachor Yamot Olam, remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past. Ask your father, he will inform you. Your elders, they will tell you. And so throughout our Jewish year, we are taught and reminded through each of our holidays, through our texts on a daily basis, the importance of memory. And we know that in terms of our own history. We know that in how we observe Yom HaZikaron and so many other moments of memory that are instilled and embedded throughout our Jewish year in times to recite Kaddish and to remember our own loved ones, but also on a more general level to remember all those who came before us, who have taught us these words, who in each generation made sure that these words, that our teachings would survive and be passed to the next generation, that they might come down to us. And so it is fitting in many ways that it is on this day of memory as Americans that we consider and take time to reflect on the Torah that has been passed to us by generations before us, not only in their words, but even more importantly, perhaps in their deeds. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who's already been quoted once tonight, wrote about this idea. Our identity is bound up horizontally with other individuals, our parents, spouse, children, neighbors, members of the community, fellow citizens, fellow Jews. We are also joined vertically to those who came before us, whose story we make our own. To be a Jew is to be a link in the chain of the generations, a character in a drama that began long before we were born and will continue long after our death. Memory is essential to identity. To be a Jew is to know that the history of our people lives on in us. And so as we hold on to that idea of memory, of memories living on, we reflect with gratitude on this day of memorial, a day when we remember all those who are part of perhaps our community, our congregations. I'd like to offer an excerpt from a Memorial Day prayer written by Rabbi Dr. Lawrence Milder. As we think of all those, in particular, our Jewish brothers and sisters, and all those who have given their lives in defense of the American ideals and values that make it possible for us to worship and learn and practice freely as Jews in this country. Our God, God of our ancestors, we thank you for the numerous blessings you have bestowed upon our nation. Out of the many nations of the world, our country has been blessed with a singular opportunity to demonstrate how peoples of many faiths and heritage can live side by side and enrich one another's lives through friendship and the sharing of our unique traditions. We are united this day in a solemn act of gratitude to those who have served in our nation's defense, to those who have risked their personal safety to save the lives of others, and above all, to those who have died serving this country. Their sacrifices are forever remembered by us and by our children for generations to come. We do not forget. Our hearts go out to those serving today in our armed forces and to their families. Those of us who are veterans of previous wars know best what they must be feeling, what their spouses and children are feeling, and what they pray for. We are united, and we ask God that all may return speedily and in good health and safety to their loved ones. May God grant each of us the wisdom to uphold this nation's virtues, that it may continue to serve as a beacon of liberty and harmony between peoples for all the world to see. Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Federation of Greater Washington for sponsoring this. I'd like to thank my dear friend, Rabbi Ori Topolowski, for really taking this on and really driving it so it could be a success. And I'd like to thank Rabbi Shankman for those very moving words about Memorial Day and about our need to remember, even as we gather in Torah, even as we gather for Torah, to remember those who gave their life in service of this country. I'd like to point to a text, as we gather here on the eve of Shavuot. It wouldn't be right to pretend that everything is normal, because everything is not normal. Everything hasn't been normal for the past few months in our country. And we've had a, so to speak, like a tremendous break tremendous shattering. We haven't been able to gather in our congregations in person. Many of us have been unable to gather with our family members. Our holidays have not been the same. Our Shabbatot have not been the same. There's been just a tremendous break. How do we gain inspiration for the receiving of the Torah, as the anniversary of the receiving of the Torah? What can our Torah share with us that's meaningful, that helps us deal with this? Now, I want to encourage everybody to think with me about a text that has been very moving for me this year especially. And that is a text from the tractate that we're studying for our Daf Yomi, the tractate Shabbat. And we're going to actually come to this text next week as part of our Daf Yomi studies. The text tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, 3 times, Moses, our great master, 3 times he made decisions without first consulting with God. And all 3 times, God agreed with him. The first of those 3 times was when Moshe Rabbeinu told the Jewish people to separate for 3 days from their spouses before they were able to receive the Torah at Sinai. They had to achieve a state of ritual purity. God, according to the Torah, had said to separate for 2 days. And on his own, Moshe said, no, you know what? We're supposed to separate for 3 days. The second major decision Moshe made without consulting with God was that Moshe on his own decided that he was so holy and the unique prophet in the world that he needed to separate from the people, from his own wife, and move his tent outside the camp. But the third event that Moshe Rabbeinu did without consulting with God, but which God praised, was when Moshe shattered the tablets. When Moshe came down from Mount Sinai after receiving the Torah, and he was carrying the tablets in his hand. And at that moment, he saw the children of Israel celebrating with the golden calf. Moshe shattered the tablets. He took the holy name of God, which was written on the tablets. He took the Torah and he broke it. How could he do such a thing? At that moment that he broke it, he did not know that there would be a second set of tablets. He broke the tablets. But, says the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, says the Talmud, that Moshe Rabbeinu was praised by God. Says the Torah that based upon the verse that says, Al-Luchot HaRishonim Asher Shibarta, that God says, engrave for yourself a second set of tablets on the first set that you yourself engraved. God, the Talmud says, Amar Reish Lakish, Yashar Kochacha Sheshibarta, that God said, Shkoyach, you did a great thing that you broke the tablets. A great thing. How could we say that this was such a great thing that Moshe Rabbeinu broke the tablets? And in fact, the very last Rashi, the very last commentary, that the greatest commentary of all the commentaries on the Torah, Rashi, the very last comment that he makes on the entire Torah is that Moshe's greatness was in the eyes of all of Israel because he broke the tablets. Because Moshe Rabbeinu broke the tablets, he was great in the eyes of all of Israel. This was what Rashi himself was saying was the greatest thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did, the breaking of the tablets. So how could that be? How could it be that this act of breaking the tablets was the defining characteristic of Moshe? So we have to say that sometimes in life, sometimes it's necessary to break something, and as you know, we're ready to go through life sometimes with a low level of tolerance of really the things that are intolerable. We're ready to tolerate things that we shouldn't be tolerating. We tolerate extreme poverty. We tolerate homelessness. We tolerate violence in the world. We tolerate people being treated unfairly. These are things we shouldn't tolerate. But there's a level of acceptance. There's a low level of acceptance that we all make. We compromise in our life, and that's how we live. But Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came down from that mountain and he saw the people celebrating the golden calf, at that moment, Moshe Rabbeinu said, this is intolerable. I will not tolerate it. I will not say life can go on as normal. It can't. We can't have the Torah existing in a world where there is this corruption. We cannot do it. And so Moshe Rabbeinu made the decision at that moment with tremendous, tremendous courage. He said that this is not appropriate. And at that moment, he broke the tablets. At that moment, he broke the tablets. I want to challenge everyone that we should be thinking to ourselves, what's our reaction to the breaking of the tablets in our lives? I feel like we've for the past 3 months, we've had broken tablets. We haven't been able to celebrate properly. We haven't been able to gather. It's like our world was shattered. But the thing is, when did God say to Moshe Rabbeinu, good job that you broke the tablets? He didn't, God, according to the Torah, according to the Talmud, did not say to Moshe Rabbeinu at the moment that Moshe broke the tablets. That's not the moment that God said to Moshe Rabbeinu, good job in breaking the tablets. According to the Talmud, Talmud cites the verse from the second set of tablets. God says to Moshe, write for yourself a new set of tablets. Good job that you broke the first set. Good job that you broke the first set. But God only says this to Moshe when Moshe is ready to write the second set of tablets. It's almost as though God is saying to Moshe that if you would have broken the tablets without having thought through, without having responded to that shattering of the tablets with a new approach, with a saying, okay, how are we going to do it better this time along? Then the breaking of the tablets would have been such a horrible catastrophe, would have been a tremendous tragedy, devastating tragedy for the world, devastating tragedy for the Jewish people to have lost the Torah. But because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't stop at the breaking of the tablets, he went back, he was teaching the children of Israel about the importance of repentance, of tshuva, of fixing their mistake, of fixing the world. Then when Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jewish people became worthy for a second set of tablets, that's when God said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Yasher Koach Shashibarta, great job that you broke the tablets. And I want to suggest to us that's our responsibility on the eve of the anniversary of the receiving of the Torah at Sinai, of Shavuot, that we have to look at this world that we've been living in as it's a world of the broken tablets. Really, there was so much brokenness before, obviously, but it's just been a catastrophic break with 100,000 people having died. What a just tremendous tragedy. 100,000 people in our country and around the world. Many, many more. It's just a tremendous breaking of our worlds. But this is also an opportunity. When something breaks, we mourn like crazy, but we have to remember that this is our opportunity, our responsibility to remind ourselves, okay, we're going to be rebuilding, but when we rebuild from this tremendous catastrophe, are we going to rebuild in a way that fixes some of the tremendous mistakes and problems that were in existence before the catastrophic break? That's what this lesson of the breaking of the tablets with Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us. That when did Moshe Rabbeinu become worthy? When did the Jewish people become worthy of saying, okay, there was something that came out of this brokenness? When Moshe Rabbeinu was ready for the second tablets. And that's our job as we start to contemplate for the first time, really re-entering into our synagogues. We're not rushing back. It's going to, whenever we're ready, we'll go back. But that time, as we start to contemplate, we shouldn't just be thinking about, okay, how do we walk back into our synagogues? We start thinking about what are some of the lessons we learned about community, about responsibility for others during this difficult time, and how when we go back into and repair the brokenness, we're going to do it in a way that reminds us to fix some of the terrible mistakes that were there beforehand. A good yontif to my friends. Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach.
Hello, hello everybody. This is Rabbi Fabian Werbin from Congregation Bethel and in Bethesda. And I want to echo my thankfulness to the Federation and to all those who are participating. I want to echo also the words of Rabbi Herzfeld and saying Yasher Koach to all those who came before me, the rabbis who spoke, Yashar Koach, and I'm sure those who will come after me will do such a great job as well. So some clarification before we start is that you may hear a weird accent. I am originally from Argentina. So if you do not understand all my presentation, I can give you the address of the Argentinian embassy. They have all the places and the names of the teachers, the English teacher back in Argentina, so you can send the complaints back there. Why I'm starting with that, especially because I want to start with a smile. There was a teacher in the Talmud, Rabbi, who usually started with Milta Dibdichuta with a joke at the beginning of the class to relax the participants, to relax the students. So with that clarification in mind, I wanted to talk about my presentation that I entitled it the Hidden Waters of Shavuot. And why I want to teach that? Basically because I wanted to do it Torah Lishma. It's my theory, something that I try to put together from my own mind. And Torah Lishma is trying to learn something together and see if you and I can learn something together. I hope you have the text and the handouts with you. If not, I'll be happy to send them later in a time. So the first thing that I wanted to point out was what happened with the creation of water. We see immediately in the book of Genesis that it says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, ve'haaretz hayta tohu ba'bo. So first God created the heaven and earth, and the world was a mess. Bechoshech al pnei tehom, and there was darkness. Beruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamim, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So when waters were created. So that's a good question. If you don't know the answer from the Bible, probably the Talmud will answer it. And in Babli, we will find it that in the Talmud Babli, we will find about the creation of water. It is says that, tohu babo, tohu is bo. This means slimy stones that are sunk in the deep, of which the waters proceeded. So the creation of water already presents a challenge. We don't know when is what created, but later we will see among our tradition and also for all humanity that waters are going to become related with or a symbol of salvation, of redemption. And immediately when the Gan Eden is created, the paradise, if I may use that word, is created, 4 rivers come out of paradise. So the issue, the theme of water immediately pops up in the story of Gan Eden. Then Noah saves the humanity from corruption and immorality. But Timaleh Haaretz Hamas, the world was totally corrupt. It was filled with corruption. And the waters come and in some ways, save the humanity from that corruption. Noah is elevated in the waters, and he is able to restart or reboot the new creation. Then we will find that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all our forefathers, have stories, important stories on wells. Then also we will see the topic of water, a recurring topic when Abraham's servant goes to find a girlfriend for Isaac. On the well, he finds Rebecca. Moses is rescued from the waters. The Nile, the Egypt's god, becomes blood in the first plague. And the ultimate salvation, the ultimate redemption comes in the partition of the Red Sea. So water is related to salvation. Where is water in our tradition? And here we find it, especially in Pesach, we can see that water is there. First of all, crossing the Red Sea. And we wash our hands twice and we dip the karpas. And water is very present. In Sukkot, we ask for rain towards the end of Sukkot. And also there was Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the libation of water, that was the greatest happiness or the greatest festival probably in back in the time. So the question is, where is the water in Shavuot? And just a parenthesis, there are other liquids in other celebrations. In Purim, of course, we get drunk with wine. And in Hanukkah, we have oil. So the idea that what I'm trying to present to today is where are the hidden waters of Shavuot? So immediately in the book of Ruth, we see that there was famine. It says, and it happened in the days of the judges, there was famine in the land. The book of Ruth starts with drought. There's not water, the waters are hiding. Then immediately, when Ruth and Naomi go back to the land of Israel, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made me made my life very bitter. So Marah, even though this is with an Aleph, Marah sounds familiar. Marah was the first place after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and they are thirsty. And what happens? They ask for water, and the waters were bitter. And it says that God transformed the waters into sweet water so they could drink it. And it says, Sham samlo chok umishpat. The Lord issued ruling and instruction for them to put them to test. And Rashi, the commentary on that, at Marah, he gave them few sections of the Torah in order that they may engage in the study of Torah. The section containing commands regarding the Shabbat, the red heifer. So a little bit of the Torah was given there in Marah. So the first water is the connection with Torah. And here, Sforno, another commentary says, Sham Nisao, they were tested there to find out if they would be willing to accept statutes, laws not given to our intelligence to understand, as well as social legislation, and they would not ignore it when they were not in a state of crisis, as now when they needed water through a miracle. And it says as follows, Fornos, the entire experience is a reminder of the manner in which rabbis relate to a potential convert to Judaism. Moreover, one of the commandments that God gave in there is, Fornos says, moreover, one advice is that if a convert comes, you will not be able to eat certain foods such as chelev. What is chelev? Is the fat. So what is the connection of a convert, chelev, and root? So I wanted to make kind of a crazy proposal here. So the gematria of root, the numeric value of the letters of the name of root is 606. If we add that, the 7 mitzvot that were given to the sons of Noah, that probably were reminding them to the people in Marah, we will get to 613. That's the total number of mitzvot. The gematria of chelev or chalav, it's the fat or the milk, is 40. It's 40 days that Moses was up in Mount Sinai to receive the commandments. But what is most, to me, was to close all the circle to the hidden waters of Shavuot that we are starting to discover them is towards the end of the book of Shavuot. And it says, the last verses describe the 10 generations from Peretz until King David. And you will read, this is the line of Peretz. Peretz was the father of Hetzron. Hetzron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Aminadab. Aminadab was the father of Nachshon. Nachshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz of Obed. Obed of Ishai. And Ishai was the father of David. Okay? So what is that? Who is in the middle of these generations is Nachshon ben Aminadab, the person who jumped into the water to have the partitions. Just in the middle of these generations, there is Nachshon ben Aminadab who make the partition of the waters. So I think we discover where the hidden waters of this holiday are. I hope you enjoyed, but what I want to wish in this case is that this small little water, little piece of water, drop of water that we are looking for, the vaccine for this plague, will not be hidden anymore, and we will be able to find it soon, to find the cure, so we can gather together and be together as a community. Chag Sameach and many blessings for you.
Thank you so much to our wonderful presenters. We will now take a short 5-minute break as we prepare for the next session. Thank you. We are back, and I'm happy to present Rabbi Jonah Lehman.
Thank you very much. And I too want to thank Federation and Rabbi Uri and all those at the Washington Board of Rabbis for creating this amazing opportunity for over 200 people to come together to study in preparation for Shavuot. And for the holiday of Shavuot, one major aspect of the holiday is remembering our experience 3,000 years ago at Mount Sinai. What that experience must have been like to have heard God's voice speak the 10 Commandments and to hear Moses teach the Torah to the people. And so an element of the holiday then is to try to reconnect to God and to try to have an incredible, awesome experience in God's presence. That by studying all night on the holiday of Shavuot, we are attempting to relive that experience at Sinai, relive that experience of revelation of God to us. And so I find personally that I experience God and my spirituality comes through study. And I have decided to take upon the Daf Yomi, the page a day cycle of Talmud study, which began back in January. And near the beginning of that cycle of 7.5 years is this section that deals with the prayers that we recite every day, mainly the Shema. And then comes this question that's on page 6a of the tractate Brachot. Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ada said that Rabbi Yitzchak said, from where is it derived that the Holy One, blessed be he, wears phylacteries, wears tefillin? So an amazing question that a rabbi would ask. And in fact, we might even suggest that it is outlandish. How could we even suggest that God would wear tefillin? That might be a heretical statement to say, because our understanding of God, I dare say, is abstract. God is out there and all around us. To even imagine that God has human form might be considered heresy. But the Torah itself describes God having human form. God's mighty hand and outstretched arm saved the Israelites, our ancestors, from Egyptian bondage. God is described as being vengeful and angry in the Torah. So God has human form and God has human emotions too. And so perhaps it's not so outlandish to suggest that God might wear tefillin. But why? What can we learn from this that would make this activity that Jews do every weekday morning? How can that be transformed by this question that Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ada said? From where do we know that God wears tefillin? So let me suggest the following. First of all, we know from the Shema that we sing and the V'ahavta paragraph that we sing morning and evening every single day. In there, we're told, bind them, that is the laws, the commandments, bind the commandments as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. So when we put on tefillin, we are fulfilling literally this commandment in the Shema. And the rabbis decide to understand this verse literally, that by putting on the tefillin, we are actually tying the commandments onto our arm and onto our head. And so this becomes then, by fulfilling the commandment, I'm putting on the tefillin now just so you see what it looks like in case you may not have seen tefillin before. Just that by putting on tefillin, we are fulfilling a commandment. And that in and of itself can be quite spiritual. to know that what we are doing every day is fulfillment of what we think is God's commandment. And so by putting on the tefillin, we are reenacting a commandment from 3,000 years ago. And we know from archaeology that archaeological discoveries that tefillin made exactly this way were discovered in Israel from 1,800 years ago. But if the rabbi in this Talmudic story suggests that not only are we fulfilling a commandment and experiencing spirituality by putting on tefillin, we are actually connecting to God. There is this concept, imitatio Dei. We are imitating God when we do certain things. So even when we put on tefillin, when we tie the tefillin on our arm, when we put it between our eyes on our head, we are imitating God. And so when we wear tefillin, we are getting closer to God too. Finally, what does the rabbi goes on and says, what is written inside God's tefillin? Because in our tefillin, in this box, there are 4 separate parchments. In the box on the arm, there is 1 parchment with 4 paragraphs, all describing the commandment to wear tefillin. So what would God have in God's tefillin? Well, there are 6 verses, all saying, who is like your people, Israel, one nation in the land? And for who is a great nation to whom God is close? Or who is a great nation who has righteous statutes? Also, happy are you, Israel, who is like you? Or has God attempted to go and take for himself a nation from the midst of another nation? And another verse, and to elevate you above all nations God has made. So not only is the rabbi having the chutzpah to suggest that God wears tefillin, the rabbi also suggests that God is reminded all the time to protect the people of Israel. So when we put on tefillin, not only are we imitating God and what God does in heaven, and that we are bringing God down to earth and mirroring what God does. So when we wear tefillin, we are imagining that God is wearing tefillin too. But also, we are daring to suggest that God is always going to protect us. In the time of the rabbis living through Roman persecution, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in the time of the Crusades, as the Crusaders marched across Europe and killed Jews on the way to Israel. In the Spanish Inquisition, when Jews were forced to convert to Christianity or to be killed, or in the Holocaust 75 years ago, and dying because we were Jewish, we're suggesting still that God is protecting us, and God will always protect us and cherish us. That even in this time of pandemic, we are suggesting by even this mundane act of putting on tefillin, we're suggesting that God always cares for us and will always care for us forever, that we are a special people. So this outlandish story by Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ada is not outlandish at all. It is a suggestion that the tefillin itself is an opportunity to imitate God and to experience a sense of God, being under the protection of God's wings. Chag Sameach.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi Jonah Lehman, and thank you for that wonderful teaching and demystifying something that's so central in our ritual practices. My name is Rachel Hirsch. I'm so delighted to be with you here tonight. And Erev Tov, everyone. I want to add my thanks also to the Jewish Federation for bringing us together, and of course to our wonderful Rabbi Uri Topolaski. So as my amazing colleagues have already cued us tonight, here we are in this final run-up to Shavuot. And we feel the anticipation getting stronger and stronger as we get closer to that moment of reliving Sinai. And we also feel the beautiful story of Ruth come alive again at this season. This is that biblical scroll that's assigned to this holiday. We read it aloud in many communities on Shavuot morning, just before the Torah reading, before the reading of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. It's as if to say, in the words of Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, the covenant at Sinai and the Torah of Moses are to be understood under the canopy of Ruth and her teaching. Ruth and her teaching. And what a teaching it is. Ruth, the story of reclaiming love in the face of loss, of finding nourishment in the midst of famine, and summoning redemption in the face of exile and alienation. Like so many teachings from so many different great religious traditions during this extraordinary time, the wisdom here in Ruth is wisdom we need right now. Each of the central iconic characters in the book of Ruth embodies a unique set of qualities, different strengths we could use in our historic moment at this season. So to start, Ruth herself is humble yet courageous. She is loyal and loving. She is selfless, and she is ultimately blessed with an important legacy and connection to the future. Ruth, of course, famously insists on remaining with Naomi, even when her mother-in-law bemoans her own cursed fate, Naomi feeling rejected by God. In Ruth's well-known speech, which forms the basis of our own conversion practices, she affirms to Naomi, as Reb Uri already quoted, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Come what may." Ruth displaces any personal pride to provide for her bereaved and hungry mother-in-law. Earlier in the beginning of the story of Ruth, after the death of Naomi's husband and sons, Naomi is described in the text as a leftover, the remains. But with Ruth's love and attention, Naomi finds the strength to go on. And then Ruth carries that leftover theme forward to the farming field when she harvests as a gleaner the leftovers and makes nourishment out of what's been discarded. Ruth marshals courage in approaching Boaz and calling on him to be her protector and redeemer. And in the end, Ruth is rewarded by bringing new life into a family stunted by death and by setting in motion the unfolding of a centrally important genealogy, a lineage that reaches backwards to our ancestor Judah and forwards into the future. This is a lineage that begins back in the book of Genesis with another story of reversal, in which another vulnerable widow, Tamar, bravely confronts an impossible situation and ultimately gives birth to Boaz's ancestor Peretz. And as we know, with her marriage to Boaz, our foreign-born Ruth becomes the great-great-grandmother of none other than King David, who heralds the Messiah. Naomi, whose name means pleasantness, sweetness, must march forward in spite of her overwhelming grief and loss. She has to continue putting one foot in front of the other as she holds on to life by a thin thread. Her passionate lament, an impulse to rename herself, as Rabbi Werbin said earlier, to rename herself as bitterness itself, are perhaps therapeutic catharsis, a healthy way of acknowledging the depth of her pain so that she could eventually move on. And Boaz, our mighty man of valor, seems to fall in love with Ruth not because of any physical beauty, but because of her virtue. And Boaz, who ensures that the family name will live on by marrying her and redeeming her from an empty widowhood. The great scholar Aviva Zornberg says this is a story with no villain, and that because there is no villain, there's no Rasha, there is no moral tension in the story. Everyone is just an essentially good person, just doing their best. But if there is no character in the story filling that role of villain, we can surely say that the grim and painful circumstances in the story form enough adversity to create plenty of moral tension. The questions arise. How will these good people face the enormous suffering that has befallen them? And in the process of facing that suffering, what will they discover about themselves? What will they discover about God? Are these not the same questions we're asking ourselves in our moment as we face our own shared adversity? In the Talmud, tractate Baba Batra, the sages discuss the order of the texts in this latter part of the Bible, the section we call Ketuvim, writings. They argue which book should come first, which one should precede the others. A suggestion rises up that maybe the order could begin with Job. And the response is made, no, we don't begin with suffering. But wait, protests another voice. The book of Ruth is also about suffering. And the answer comes, Hi puranutza de itle acharita. This suffering in the story of Ruth is suffering with a purpose, with a future in mind. We all want to know that our suffering has meaning. Knowing that may make the suffering that much more bearable. And with so much suffering in our communities, in our country, in our world right now, what will help us hold on and keep us focused on the future as Ruth was able to do? I wanted to share this conundrum I've been struggling with. In our morning davening, I keep tripping over a certain passage in the Amidah. It's the one called Birkat Hashanim. This is the part of the weekday prayer that focuses on the blessing of plenty in our agriculture. It is the passage where we say, Barech Shnatenu Kashanim Hatovot. Bless our year, our Shana, to be like one of the good years. Kashanim Hatovot. And for the last few months, every time I've come to this passage, I couldn't help but protest in my mind. How can this be one of the good years? So many are sick and dying. So many are hungry and afraid. This is a terrible year. But part of the answer is in finding that same goodness, that tvuata tova, literally good produce, as the prayer says. That goodness that's on display in the story of Ruth here and now in our own lives. And though the prayer, okay, yes, refers to produce from the earth, we can interpret it to mean our own spiritual produce. What comes forth from us, from the fertile soil of our own souls. We've seen much of that loyalty, that loving kindness, that selflessness in the way so many have responded to the extraordinary needs our pandemic has stimulated. In that elusive and significant way, this can indeed be one of the good years. Coming together to face this avalanche of adversity, to cry out as Naomi did, and to persevere in love as Ruth did, is where we discover a goodness we hadn't known in ourselves, a capacity to endure real pain and to respond with even more generosity, even more compassion, even more goodness, like Ruth and like Boaz, even more valor. So yes, this can still be one of the good years. In closing, I'd like to try to connect the book of Ruth with this day, Memorial Day. One of the central themes in Ruth is that phrase spoken by Boaz as he marries Ruth, when he says this marriage is in order to raise up the name of the dead, lehakim shem hamet, to ensure that family lineage won't be cut off from its own future. While we in the Jewish community turn our attention to our beloved festival season, we also stand with all the families of our country who are remembering loved ones who made the ultimate sacrifice for our safety and freedom. We are the grateful beneficiaries of their service. And may those names be raised up and be a source of comfort and a source of inspiration for the ones who now remember. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach, everyone. May our blintzes be light and our Torah be rich.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And thank you to Rabbi Hirsch for that beautiful Torah. It was really so inspiring, and it's a real honor to be amongst all my rabbinic colleagues this evening. I would like to do a brief teaching from Rav Yitzchak Hutner, the Pachad Yitzchak. It's really an amazing book. Especially the section on Shavuot is known to be very, very special. Just a brief word about Rav Hutner. Rav Hutner was born in 1906 in Warsaw, and he passed away in 1980 in New York or in Israel, I'm not exactly sure. But there's something very interesting about Rav Hutner's past is that he actually had one parent who was a Chassid from a Hasidic family, and another parent from a Litvish family, from a non-Hasidic family, and therefore his Torah really was a synthesis of both. And in his work, the Pachad Yitzchak, he wrote what was called ma'amarim, different essays, if you will, and they really bring together all these beautiful traditions from his past. And something that's very interesting about the Pachad Yitzchak on Shavuot is that many people might know the history of Rav Hutner. Rav Hutner actually, on September 6, 1970, he was traveling with his wife, with his daughter and son-in-law on the way back from Israel. And unfortunately, they were on a flight that was hijacked by the PFLP, a Palestinian terrorist organization. He was actually in captivity from September 6, 1970 until September 26th. He lost about 40 pounds during the ordeal. Afterwards, they were finally released. And it was reported that one of his students was the first to encounter him, and his student gave him his own shirt, his talit katan, his tzitzis. Why? Because Rabbi Hutner's talit, tefillin, and shirt and jacket and hat had all been confiscated during this ordeal. The truth of the matter is, it was not only those things that were confiscated. This book itself, well, not this actual book, but the manuscript of the Pachad Yitzchak on Shavuot was actually confiscated by the terrorists. And there's a whole story behind it because the students tried to get it back. They even tried to make deals with the terrorists in order to get the manuscript back, but to no avail. They were not successful in getting it back. And eventually what had to happen is that some of the students, based on remembering what their Rebbe had taught them, they reconstructed this book. So this book actually has a great history to it. Anyways, one of the pieces on Shavuot has to do with the Birkat HaTorah, the blessings that we make. Every single morning when we make up, we make 3 blessings on the Torah, very special blessings in order to frame our Torah learning. And there's a question that's asked by Tosfos. This is the beginning of Rav Hutner's piece. And the question is as follows: Lama birchas haTorah poteres kol hayom. Why is it that the blessings that we make on Torah in the morning, they exempt you from making any further blessing for the rest of the day? So if you make the blessings in the morning when you wake up and you study some Torah, and then you go to work, and at 12 o'clock, you pull out a book, you start studying, you study again at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The brachos that you made in the beginning of the day exempt you for the whole day. Why is this? Let's say for the mitzvah of sukkah. If you would actually go ahead and make a bracha in the beginning of the morning on going into the sukkah for the first time, and then you would go in a few hours later, you'd have to make another bracha. So why is that the case? So Tosfos answers, the Shani Torah is different. She'eino mityaesh daito. Never give up on learning. Why? Because you're obligated to study Torah each and every moment, as the verse says, "V'higisa bo yomam v'layla." You must study the Torah day and night. And consequently, there's always a mitzvah of Torah study incumbent upon you, so you're never done learning. And since you're never done learning, the one bracha that you make in the morning exempts you for the rest of the day. So that's what Tosfos says. But the question that Rav Hutner asks, and many other people ask, is that we have other mitzvot that apply the whole day. For instance, tefillin, putting on the tefillin that Rabbi Lehman talked about before, even though we only wear them in the morning, but really the mitzvah of tefillin is the whole day. Yet if you put on tefillin multiple times a day, the law is you would make a bracha each and every time. So what is so special about Torah study? So Rav Hutner goes on to quote a Gemara that I think was quoted by Rabbi Hertzfeld, which is that Ta'amim shebitula shel Torah zuhi kiyuma. Sometimes not studying Torah is the way we fulfill Torah. And Rashi explains, how is that possible? But let's say I'm studying Torah, And all of a sudden, some chesed opportunity arrives, something that I could do. I can help out a bride, I can help out a groom, I can help out someone who, there's a death in the community and I need to help out. I have to stop my study and go do those things. Even though normally the rule is that if you're doing one mitzvah, you're exempt from a second mitzvah. But when it comes to Torah study, even if you're studying, you have to be mevatel Torah. You have to stop studying Torah. Why? Because the whole idea of learning Torah is lilmod al minas lasos. We study in order to do. So if you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, to actualize your learning, and you don't, that doesn't make any sense. That's a nullification of Torah. So therefore, the way that you fulfill Torah is by nullifying it and going and doing the mitzvot by stopping to learn and do that. And it's not only great mitzvot, like taking care of a bride and groom or taking care of someone who has passed away. It's really the mitzvot that we do all the time to function in the world. For instance, he says the mitzvah of v'asafta degancha, which is the mitzvah of gathering in your wheat, the mitzvah of actually earning a living. That's also a mitzvah, to provide for your family, to provide for yourself so that you could eat, so you could do things. So we have all of these mitzvot. So basically the idea is the reason why, Rav Hutner goes back to the original question, the reason why we make one blessing in the morning, and then we go off to work and we do our work stuff, and we come home, then we cook some food, we do things for our families, maybe we do a mitzvah, maybe we do chesed, and throughout the day, maybe we learn a few times. But says Rav Hutner, the lesson of the Birkat HaTorah, of the blessing on the Torah, is that really it's a one long 24-hour Torah study session. Yes, we only learned a few hours, but we learned and then we fulfilled Torah. How do we fulfill Torah? By working, by earning money so that we can actually fulfill our values. We did things to help our family. We spent time with friends. We spent time doing mitzvot. So it turns out that essentially, in a certain way, our whole day ended up being Torah study. And what he says is, it's as if there was learning, which was a ma'isa hefsek v'hesek hadas. There was no interruption in terms of our learning the entire day, and that's exactly what you ended up doing. And I think that this idea, it's a very important perspective that we can have on life. Because you can have two people who could go through life and go through a day. They could actually spend the same amount of time studying Torah, but the question is, what is their ultimate goal? What is their ultimate value? Is there value to actualize God's word? Is there value to actualize our deep values as Jews and to make sure that we are fulfilling that? And even in the time that we're not actually doing it because we're working, we're with friends, we're with family, we're doing other kinds of things, that's actually a kiyum, a fulfillment of Torah study itself. On the other hand, it's possible that we could spend a lot of time studying Torah, but it's just being done as an intellectual pursuit. It's not something that actually enters into our heart. It's not something that actually enters into our soul. And therefore, the time that we're not studying Torah is actually not doing anything, which is a fulfillment of the Torah. It's not actualizing what we do. So I believe that the Birkot HaTorah, the blessings that we make on the Torah, are so important. It's not just an add-on. Oh, it's a nice thing to make the blessing on the Torah. Actually, the blessings on the Torah frame our whole day. They frame what we're trying to do. And it's really to take our important values, our learning, the things that we say we value so much, and let's see how we can make them a reality in our lives. So I bless us all that this year on Shavuos, we take the beauty of the blessings of the Torah, bring it into our life. The Hagisa Bo Yomam V'Layla, we study it day and night, but sometimes we don't. But even when we're not, in a certain way, we're fulfilling the Torah as well. Thank you. I want to wish everybody a Chag Sameach.
And now presenting Rabbi Adam Raskin.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Raskin. I'm the rabbi at Congregation Har Shalom in Potomac. And I also want to extend my gratitude to the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, the Washington Board of Rabbis, the JCRC, Hadar, to Gil, to Mandy, to my friend, Rabbi Uri Topolowski, everyone for organizing and curating this event tonight. It's great to be with all of you and with my friends and colleagues from around the community. Now, there's a verse in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 9, which says, Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh, which means there really is nothing new under the sun. And I think one possible meaning of that verse is that there are very few events or circumstances in the thousands of years of Jewish history that our ancestors have not seen or confronted in some way, shape, or form. And major health crises are included in that. For the past several weeks, I've been interested in models of Jewish leadership when community is faced with similar challenges in the past. And it just so happens that in the early to mid 19th century, the world was gripped with a horrible, raging cholera pandemic. Millions of people died between the years of 1829 and 1852 all over the world. Cholera, in case you're not familiar, is a horrible water-based bacteria that causes the loss of large amounts of fluid. The symptoms are really dreadful: diarrhea and vomiting and dehydration. Some victims died within hours of first showing those symptoms. It was a terrible public health crisis. So the city of Vilna, which was the largest city in Lithuania, was home to 100,000 Jews before the First World War. 45% of the city's population was Jewish. There were over 100 shuls, a half a dozen daily Jewish newspapers. It was a hotbed of Hebrew and Yiddish literature. It was the center of the Bund, the Jewish labor movement. There were numerous Jewish communal organizations, and one of its most renowned leaders was named Rabbi Israel ben Ze'ev Wolf Lipkin. He was born in 1810 to a rabbinic family on the Latvian border, about 160 miles north of Vilna. And when he was just 12 years old, he moved to the town of Salant, where he became an outstanding Torah scholar. And for most of the rest of history, Salant was kind of added onto his name because that's where he really made a name for himself as a scholar and a gadol. And when he was only 33 years old, he was appointed the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Talmudical Academy at Tomchei Torah in Vilna. Now, he was known for his incredibly deep piety, his learning, and he's also known for promoting the Musar movement, which has experienced a resurgence in popularity and interest lately, a spiritual practice of cultivating a life of virtue and moral discipline. So it was at the height of Vilna's cholera epidemic that this brilliant, scholarly, charismatic rabbi decided to make a public, courageous, controversial statement. His community was suffering. Disease and death were everywhere, and there was no end in sight. So imagine Yom Kippur in the year 5609, corresponding to 1848. Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant did the unthinkable. Now, there are many different accounts of this story. Some of them identify Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant, others do not. It's been retold by Yiddish writers, by Russian historians, even Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant's own son, Rabbi Yitzchak Lipkin, who would have been 8 years old at the time of this Yom Kippur. Listen to this excerpt from the 19th century Hebrew and Yiddish writer David Frischman. He says, Ma'aseh bishlosha she'achlu. This is the story of 3 who ate. Lo be'achad hayamim hapshutim mimei Shabbatot, not that they ate on any old day of the week, ki im b'yom HaKippurim. Rather, they ate on Yom Kippur. Lo b'makom seiter be'en ro'eu ve'en yodea, not in some hidden place where no one could see or no one knew what they were doing. Ki im le'enei kol Yisrael. Rather, they ate in the sight of the entire Jewish community. Asher bebeit HaKnesset HaGadol, who were gathered together in the great synagogue on Yom Kippur. Lo anashim rekim ufuchazim. These weren't lightweights or reckless individuals. Ki'im min nisi'ei ha'edah. They were the princes. They were the leaders of the community. In Frischman's account, towards the end of the Musaf service on Yom Kippur afternoon, Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant stood up in the synagogue and announced, with the permission of God and the permission of the community, we hereby permit people to eat and drink today. Just then, the shamus, the synagogue beadle, brought forth a cup of wine and some cake, and the rabbi and two synagogue officials ate and drank in the sight of the entire community. In the Yiddish book Gedolim von unser Zeit, the author Jacob Mark identifies the rabbi in the story as Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant. He further wrote that the Dayanim, the religious establishment, the rabbinic establishment in Vilna, was outraged by this decree and publicly opposed it. In yet another version, Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant posted placards all over Vilna. These placards said that services on the high holidays would be modified this year. No extra piyutim, no extra readings. It advised people to spend time outside, breathing fresh air. It announced in the courtyards of shuls, tables with cakes and drinks would be there available for people to take it if they felt weak, if they needed it, if they weren't well, and they didn't have to ask anyone first. Some say the rabbi did not make kiddush or eat publicly, he just made it available and gave others the permission to do so. But of all the versions of this story that exists, and there are even more than what I mentioned, here is what we know about Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant. We know that he raised funds to establish a makeshift hospital in a building that he rented with a capacity of 1,500 beds, and that he convinced local doctors to treat the sick and suffering without pay. We know that he organized groups of students from his yeshiva to be first responders, so to speak, to be on call if someone fell ill and needed help. We know that he reminded people that certain stringencies could be relaxed at that time in order for people to properly care for their health and well-being. And we know that he told people to follow their doctor's orders and not to try to be overly pious during a public health emergency. Now, some of the story of that Yom Kippur of 5609, 1848 in Vilna is certainly affected by legend and folklore, but what I take from it is that Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant understood that to be a religious leader, to be a communal leader, to be a teacher of Judaism's supreme values meant that reminding people that caring for their health and protecting others, that trusting and promoting both science and medicine in pursuit of the care of those who had been afflicted, that upholding human life above all other considerations are actually the greatest form of piety, the most religious response, the highest service to God in times like these. As we face our current pandemic, and soon we will also be in the midst of another high holiday season, we should remember the courageous leadership of Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant. And we should also remember the words of the Torah that undoubtedly informed his courage. V'chai bahem. We are meant to live by the mitzvot, that nothing is more precious than life. May we all be blessed with good health. May we have strength and wisdom and the capacity to care for others. May we channel the courage and conviction of great religious leaders like Rabbi Israel Lipkin Salant as we anxiously await the eradication of this pandemic. B'mheira v'yameinu, may it come speedily and in our day. And with that, I wish each and every one of you and your families, your loved ones and friends, a Chag Shavuot Sameach.
Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. And now we'll take another 5-minute break as we prepare for the next session. Thank you for joining us. We will begin in another few minutes at 7:35.
I want to ask a question. Who's your rabbi? Do you have a rabbi? Now, if I was asking you this question back in the first temple period, I came up to you in the marketplace and said, who's your rabbi? Your answer would be, what's a rabbi? Because in the first temple era of Judaism, the concept of rabbi was first being imagined. If I came up to you in the shtetl, in Poland or Ukraine, who's your rabbi? The answer would be obvious. You're in a shtetl. There's only one rabbi. Maybe if you're in a bigger town, there'd be 2 rabbis or 3, but it would be obvious who your rabbi was. You would belong to a synagogue, and that man on the bima, that's your rabbi. Well, welcome to the year 2020. It's not so obvious anymore who's your rabbi. In fact, you could ask, why should I have a rabbi? Can I have more than one rabbi? Or Rabbi Evan, why are you asking this question? Demographics tell us that in the Washington region, about 1/4 of the households belong to a synagogue. For those people, they might answer my question, who is, by saying, oh, the rabbi at my synagogue is my rabbi. If there's more than one rabbi at that synagogue, maybe they have 2 rabbis or 3. So who's your rabbi if you don't belong to a synagogue? Who's your rabbi if you do belong to a synagogue? Well, let's say you study on Zoom every once in a while with some wonderful rabbis from New York or Los Angeles or Israel. What if you attend conferences like Limud or a conservative movement, biennial, whatever? And you go and you hear some great speakers and you run up to them, you want to talk to them and engage them, you want to learn from them. You want them to be your rabbi. And who is it that you turn to in times of worry, of concern? Someone not for their learning, but for their compassion, for their heart, for their chesed, their loving kindness. That might be your rabbi. So the rabbi could be somebody you want to learn from. The rabbi could be someone who you have a relationship with that brings you comfort and peace. In fact, you could have several rabbis. If you couldn't tell from my accent, I'm from New York. New Yorkers, not uniquely, but often, have a habit of saying my dentist is the best dentist. My rabbi, that's a rabbi. We like to own other people in a way. We think about what is mine. So my rabbi is the person, when I was growing up, who gave guidance, who taught us what the Jewish law was, who was revered, mostly. And then things started to change. About 20 years ago in particular, something called the internet. We all had access in new and exciting ways to all sorts of rabbis. And in a modern age, we started to realize that there wasn't just one sort of rabbi. There wasn't just the rabbi of the synagogue. Well, if 25% of Jews in the Washington area belong to a synagogue, what about the other 75%? Do they have a rabbi? Do they need a rabbi? Do they want a rabbi? Perhaps. So I've been thinking a lot about this. As a rabbi, and one not affiliated with a movement and not located at a synagogue, sometimes people come to me with questions. They want me to be a Jewish resource. I would say they want me to be their rabbi. So they might ask a question. They don't know a certain law. They don't know a certain custom. And sometimes there aren't clear answers for all of their questions. For example, I was once asked a question about when Yortzeit would be for someone whose mother had passed away. His mother had passed away in a leap year. His mother wasn't buried right away. So it turns out that under our halacha, our Jewish way, our Jewish law, there's not one clear answer as to exactly when the Yortzeit would be. There are different opinions. We're Jews, of course there's different opinions. So how do I answer? I look at the person, and I'm supposed to answer the person, as my dear friend Rabbi Mike Moskowitz would teach. You're not supposed to answer a question, you're supposed to answer the person. And yet, what does our tradition say? Our tradition teaches us, especially as it's told in the Talmud, that one rabbi doesn't step on another rabbi's turf. So if Rav in his community says, this is how you do it, Rabbi Shmuel doesn't come along and say, I got a different answer. Someone asks me a question, I want to know a few things about them. Do you belong to a synagogue? Who is your rabbi? Why are you asking me this question? Are you going to shop around for other answers? Forum shopping is not a good idea under Jewish law, because we want you to revere the rabbi. Look, this is a long tradition, a rabbinic period of over 2,000 years that has been developed. And the rabbis have carefully crafted a system that focuses questions of Jewish law, of life, tradition, funneling them so that you ask the rabbi, your rabbi. So who's your rabbi? 2,000-year tradition is being challenged by an internet with Zoom meetings, with access to rabbis in Israel and New York and Los Angeles and Washington. We're being challenged by the idea that we don't have to belong to a synagogue. Although I strongly urge everyone out there, if you don't belong to a synagogue, now would be a really good time to join one. Who is your rabbi? It's a huge question for us in the year 2020. I think it's something that's worth considering. Putting your faith into another person to be your teacher is one sort of rabbi relationship. Another might be the person who gives you comfort, the person who gives you guidance, the person who holds your neshama, your soul, with tender hands. And there may be other kinds of rabbis. There are rabbis who are political activists. There are rabbis who are community leaders. There are all sorts of rabbis now, just like there's many kinds of doctors, many kinds of rabbis. You may have more than one rabbi. We shouldn't throw away the tradition too quickly, though. There is something wonderful about knowing that you have a deep connection with another human being who is your resource, who is your source of information about your Jewish practices. It will help you to feel more comfortable, get all the knowledge you can, and ask that question, who is my rabbi? Based on what you need and what Judaism has to offer. It has a huge wealth of great knowledge, wisdom, love, and caring that will enhance your life if only you can find the right rabbi to help guide you along the way. I thank the Federation, the Washington Board of Rabbis, and all of you for participating here today. It's been a pleasure.
I'm sorry, having a technical difficulty as we wait for Rabbi Eitan Cooper. We will move on to Rabbi Mark Israel and come back to Rabbi Eitan Cooper.
I hope this is working. Good evening. This is Rabbi Mark Israel. Hopefully the piano in the background will stop in a moment. I believe it just did. The timing shift threw us off by a minute. But that is part of parenting, right? Always having to make adjustments and to be able to go with the flow. And that's exactly what I want to talk about this evening with you for a few minutes is the commandment that we are to honor our parents. It, in many ways, stands out among all of the commands. We, of course, on Friday morning, we'll be reenacting, really, the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. We don't know exactly how much of the Torah was given at that moment, what was revealed, but most believe that at least the 10 Commandments were revealed at that time. And when we look at the 10 Commandments, traditionally they are laid out on 2 tablets, unless you're watching Mel Brooks, in which case it's 3 tablets. But on the 2-tablet version, the actual Aseret HaDibrot, we have 5 commandments typically laid out on one side and 5 on the other. The first 4 on the right side deal exclusively with commandments regarding our relationship between us and God. The last 5 deal with our relationships between us and other human beings. The question is, the fifth one. The fifth one is the one that is most unusual, I would say, of all of the commandments. And that is because it is at the same time dealing with issues of our relationship with one another and our relationship with God. Hold on just one moment, please. Sorry for just a moment there. I don't want to have the noise disrupting. So on the one hand, right, the commandment is about human beings. Our parents are human beings. Right? But it's also on the side of the commandments where the other commandments are dealing with God. And so we're going to take a look at that, and we're especially looking at it with the concept of how do we understand differences in gender and how that plays out in the rabbinic understanding of the text. Okay. So on the first issue, right, the Ten Commandments appears in different forms in different places. We have it in Shemot, in the book of Exodus, in Parshat Yitro. We see it again in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, in Parshat Be'et Hanan. And then the third one is there is a recapitulation of it in Parshat Kedoshim, in Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus. The first two there that I mentioned, the ones from Deuteronomy and Exodus, have the same language. Right? We are told that we are to kibud et avicha ve'et imecha, and we are told here, and this is one of the other unusual aspects of this command, that there is a reward that comes along with it. Right? That is not true of any of the other commandments in the Aser Tadibrot. But here we're told, and in different ways, right? At one point we're told, L'ma'an yarichun yamecha al adama asher Hashem noten lacha, that if we follow this commandment, then our days will be lengthened on the land that God has given to us. And on the Deuteronomy side, it tells us L'ma'an yarichun yamecha, that it is in order to lengthen our days without any qualification, and L'ma'an yetiv lecha al haaretz Hashem noten lecha, that it's also so that we will live well within the land. So there's something about this commandment, right, that seems to have to do with the length and the quality of our life. Right? So the rabbis take a look at this, right? And one of the questions that they ask is, who is exactly commanded, right? And why? Right? So in Kiddushin, in the Babylonian Talmud, it says, Tanu Rabbanan Ne'emar, Kaved et avicha ve'et imecha, that the sages taught that it is stated, honor your father and your mother. And there's also another verse that uses the same verb formulation in the book of Proverbs that says, Kaved et Adonai me'onecha, that we should honor God with our wealth. And so it equates, because it uses the exact same formulation with the verb, honoring your father and your mother with honoring God. And says that the verse therefore means that we should honor our father and mother in the same way that we honor God. Right? We'll unpack that a little bit as we go on here. The text then goes on, and it tells us that it is also stated, though, that a person should fear one's mother and father. This is the text from Leviticus. Ish imo va'aviv tira'u, that one should fear or have reverence for one's mother and father. And it also there says, there is also another verse from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, that says that et Hashem Elokecha tira'u, ve'oto ta'avod, that we should also have fear, awe of God and in our service to God. And so we again equate the two, right? So that the honoring of our parents, the awe, reverence that we're supposed to show our parents is somehow related to God, right? And this is why, at least according to some interpretations, we find it on the God side, because our relationship with our parents in some ways becomes our model for our relationship with God, and vice versa. Right? The respect that is due to God, likewise we are to show to our parents. Right? Now, the rabbis notice, though, that there is a switch in the order of who is listed first here. Right? So in the text from Deuteronomy and from Exodus, it lists the father first, and then in the text from Leviticus, the mother is listed first. Ish imo va'aviv tira'u, that a person should have reverence or awe or fear for their mother and father. And we see down below in the text, for those who may have the text sheet in front of you, it's the last text that I'm referencing right now. Right? It says that it is taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said, it is revealed and known before the one who spoke and the world came into being, right, that being God, that a child honors one's mother more than honors one's father. That our natural inclination, in other words, is to honor our mother in a greater way than it is towards our father. And therefore, the mitzvah, right, lists first the father, because we naturally would do honor our mother, and we need to be told that we also need to honor our father in the same way. Right? And we'll unpack it again in just a moment. So if that doesn't sit so comfortably with you, that's okay. Then it goes on to say, right, that it is revealed and known before the one who spoke and the world came into being. Again, the same language, right? That from the time of God, it is known that a child fears one's father more than one's mother. And it explains because the father teaches Torah and consequently is strict. Right? With the mother's honor, it was because she provided sustenance to him. Right? But here, right, the idea that the father is to be feared because he's more strict. He's going to be the one who is going to inspire that awe in a more natural way, and the mother is needs to be preceded, therefore.
Can you wrap it up in the next 2 seconds?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. And then where the text then takes us, right, is the understanding, right? So we have these gender stereotypes, right? The gender stereotypes have to do with what happens on that human level of things, right? When it was talking before about the godly level of it, it was very much emphasizing the equality. Right? And the text tells us, though, and this is the synthesis of the two, right, is that all three are partners in a person's creation. This is that third text there. There are three partners in forming a person, the Holy One of Blessing who provides the soul, the father, and the mother. And when a person honors one's father and mother, God ascribes to them that I will treat it as if you honor me as well. And that's where we want to get to, recognizing that there are gender distinctions, but we ultimately want to recognize as well the equality that is laid out for us by the model of God.
Thank you so much. Ready to start.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry for any of the technical issues before. I strangely got kicked off of Zoom somehow. And I want to, before I start, I want to thank the Federation and the Washington Board of Rabbis, and of course, all the presenters and organizers of this wonderful event. It's great to be with all of you. So I grew up in a large family. I have 4 brothers, and inevitably, over the years, we have compared ourselves to one another. And yes, occasionally we may gloat or claim superiority over each other. And I sometimes imagine what would be if our Jewish holidays themselves were siblings with feelings and voices of their own. What would they say to each other? Would they compare themselves to each other? Would they gloat, or would they claim superiority like I do with my brothers? I could imagine Pesach, the first holiday described in the Torah, the oldest of the siblings, saying something like, guys, I'm the oldest, most honored in the family. Everyone makes a big deal out of me and my Seder. I'm probably the most recognizable member of the family. Almost every Jew knows about me. Treat me with the respect that I deserve. Sukkot, on the other hand, may chime in. Guys, I finished off the holiday season. I'm the last of the 3 major holidays. That in itself makes me special. And you know there is something sweet about youngest siblings. And of course, people love making Sukkot and putting up awesome decorations. My lulav, my etrog are unique and distinct. Everyone looks forward to celebrating me. And Shavuot, what would they say? What about me? Perhaps a bit dejected, they'd say, I don't have as much to show off as either of you, but please don't forget me. The truth is, Shavuot can often feel like the forgotten middle child of our biblically commanded holidays. It's a shorter holiday, only 1 day in Israel and 2 outside of Israel, compared to Pesach and Sukkot, which are each 1 week long. Shavuot is also without too many memorable or widely observed traditions, other than perhaps for some people eating cheesecake. And it's celebrated by far fewer than Pesach and Sukkot. And there's probably perhaps good reason for Shavuot's relative obscurity. The 3 holidays of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, as described in the Pshat, the simple reading of the Torah, follow the agricultural cycle. Pesach is the start of the season of growing, the springtime holiday, specifically the start of the grain harvest season when barley was harvested. And Sukkot, known as Chag HaAsif, the ingathering festival, marks the end of the fruit harvest and really the end of the full agricultural year of harvesting. And what is Shavuot? The holiday of bringing bikurim, first fruits of the wheat harvest, which took 7 weeks to grow since Pesach. It's an important occasion, though in many ways it is tacked on to the agricultural celebrations of Pesach, with the wheat harvest serving as the conclusion of the grain harvest. It's really in some ways somewhat of an afterthought. Of course, Shavuot has a second meaning that it has adopted beyond the agricultural. We celebrate the giving of the Torah, which took place 7 weeks after the Exodus from Egypt that we celebrated at Pesach. But even this added layer of meaning, of course, an important one, feels maybe lackluster compared to the other holidays. Shavuot still lacks the signs and symbols and fame that its siblings, Pesach and Sukkot, possess. But I want to offer one angle that perhaps can make Shavuot a bit more meaningful for you this year, especially as we celebrate this holiday in the midst of a pandemic. For me, Shavuot, more than any other Jewish holiday, is a time that is all about love and commitment. To be fully transparent, I have a personal stake in this and making this argument. My wife and I have Shavuot to thank for us being together, as the time we spent together 13 years ago on Shavuot was the first step in our relationship which led us to being married today. But it's not just my own biases and relationship experience at play here. There really is something unique about Shavuot's themes that emphasize love and commitment, specifically between the Jewish people and God. For example, there's a tradition to stay up all night on Shavuot to demonstrate our commitment and love to Torah. We literally cannot part ways with it, and our love for it keeps us awake at night. The giving of the Torah is likened by many to the giving of a ketubah, a marriage contract between God and the Jewish people. Also, Mount Sinai, Har Sinai itself, is likened to a chuppah, a wedding canopy in a number of Jewish sources. Many even have the custom of decorating the synagogue, or this year maybe your home, with flowers and greenery, as tradition says that Mount Sinai was decorated with flowers when the Torah was given, not unlike decorating a chuppah with flowers. Some Sephardic Jews, I learned, even have the custom of reading a special Shavuot ketubah. There have been a number of texts written over the last many centuries. If we put aside the agricultural lens for a moment, exchanging it for this new approach of love and commitment, Shavuot may actually, in fact, be the most important of the holidays. Let me explain. Pesach represents the exodus from Egypt, God's engagement to the Jewish people. What better marriage proposal could there have been than the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea? It was in these moments that God said to the Jewish people, I want you to be mine. Sukkot, on the other end, resembles us building a life together with God, literally creating a home or a booth together, which takes the form of a sukkah. The sukkah represents the home that we build with God. And Shavuot, in the middle of Pesach and Sukkot, is our wedding day. It took 7 weeks for the Jewish people to consider the proposal made by God on Pesach. It actually was a very short engagement, 7 weeks from Pesach to Shavuot, 7 weeks from engagement to marriage under the chuppah that was at Har Sinai, until the giving of a marriage contract in the form of the Torah. 7 weeks until the most important day in our relationship with God and the Torah. In a way, then, Shavuot occupies the center of a different cycle, that of our relationship with God and the Torah. It doesn't feature the courtship of Pesach or the home building of Sukkot. It's just us and God and the Torah that is our marriage contract, perhaps the most important piece of our identity and tradition. Shavuot is about love and commitment to more than just God, though. The Torah for which we express our love asks of us to treat others with love and respect. Expressing love for the Torah, loving the Torah is thus an expression of love for the concept of loving our neighbors. In this way, Shavuot is a time for us to not only consider the Torah and why we love it, but also, importantly, who the Torah asks us to love. As we all continue our lives in isolation, battling this pandemic, I pray for all of us that we can experience this Shavuot as a moment of love for God and the Torah. I pray that this can be a moment for us to consider our commitment to the Torah that spells out our end of the relationship with God. And most importantly, as Shavuot asks us to consider not only our love and commitment to the Torah, but also what the Torah asks of us, love, so much love and commitment for those around us. May we all have a Chag Sameach.
Hello, everybody. And I wanted to offer my thanks and my gratitude to everybody who's helped to put this wonderful program together. I'm Stephanie Bernstein, one of the rabbis at Temple Road of Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia. I wanted to talk with you tonight a little bit about a text from the Talmud Bavli. And the text itself is on the event program page, but no worries if you don't have access to it. I'm just going to share parts of it with you. And I wanted to begin by talking about the fact that Ruth in our tradition is really the prototype of someone who has the kind of attitude and outlook with which someone should approach conversion to Judaism. And Ruth's choice to remain with her mother-in-law Naomi really parallels our choice to accept Torah and our recommitment to Torah on Shavuot. We know that after the destruction of the Second Temple, the rabbis had to decide how they were going to respond to those who wanted to join the Jewish people through conversion. What sort of attitude should potential converts display? Were there reasons that might be disqualifying? And tonight we're going to explore some of the challenges that the rabbis faced as we study this text from the Talmud Bavli, which is a study in contrast between Hillel and Shammai and their approaches to conversion. And of course, text being text, there are other issues as well for us to examine. So the first thing that I wanted to share with you is that this particular piece of text from the Talmud Bavli is a text of what is called Agadah. And thank you so much. I see that the text has now been put up in the chat if you'd like to follow along. So this is a section of Agadah, and Agadah may sound familiar, similar to the word Haggadah from the Hebrew word lahagid, which means to tell. So this is non-legal material in the Talmud, but of course it's designed to teach us something. So how about our protagonists, Hillel and Shammai? Who were they? They were both very renowned rabbis who lived during the 1st century of the Common Era, probably during the time of King Herod. And the influence of their teachings on both the Mishnah and the Talmud is enormous. The Talmud Bavli records over 300 differences of opinion between them and their disciples. However, both of their points of view were considered to be valid. So in the text, we're going to see that various non-Jews who are interested in joining the Jewish people through conversion approach Hillel and Shammai. And there's another issue here as well, which is the understanding of whether the Torah is of a piece, the written Torah, the Torah given at Sinai, and the oral Torah, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. So in a section of the text prior to the one we're going to study, a Gentile comes before Shammai and he says, Kama Torah yesh lachem, how many Torahs do you guys have? And Shammai says, we have 2, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So the Gentile says to him, you know what, with regard to the written Torah, the one that we were given at Sinai, I believe you. With regard to the oral Torah, I do not believe you. Convert me on the condition that you will teach me only the written Torah. So we know that this was an issue as well. So the piece of text that I would like us to focus on is on the 2nd page of the text sheet that you have. There was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, convert me on the condition that you will teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Shammai pushed him away with a builder's cubit in his hand. And parenthetically, the builder's cubit was a common unit of measure. And guess what? Shammai was a builder by trade. The same Gentile comes before Hillel, who converts Hillel and says to the Gentile, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Now go and study. So what's going on here? Of course, there's the very important message that what is hateful to us, we should not do to others. Information about how we are to treat potential converts whose motivations for joining the Jewish people may not be what we would like. And finally, what does this text mean for us? So let's look at 2 areas in particular. The attitudes with which we should approach those who want to convert to Judaism, and what does this text mean for our own relationship with Torah. So with Hillel and Shammai's discussion, we know that conversion was a growing issue of concern for the rabbis. Perhaps there was suspicion of the motivation of those who wanted to convert. And we see in the text that Hillel reacts with patience and humility. He gives this guy who really is asking some kind of cheeky questions the benefit of the doubt. Shammai is a builder. And although he pushes this fellow away, we know that builders are concerned with structural integrity. They need to build a structure that's going to stand the test of time. And in this case, Shammai's structure that he's building is that of the Jewish people. And rabbis and cantors who have the privilege of studying with people for conversion, are really gatekeepers in this process, a responsibility that we take very seriously. So the second issue that I'd like to explore with you is, what is our own relationship to Torah? Because this text is almost having us, through the eyes of the convert, say, what does Torah mean to us? It's almost like asking for something, a recommendation for a friend. The convert is somebody through whose eyes and mouth we can ask the questions that we want to ask. So Hillel teaches on one foot this version of the golden rule: what's hateful to you, don't do to other people. And then he says, the rest is interpretation, go and study. So what's he saying here? He's saying, for now, this is it. But there's much more later, and that you must also learn. How much Torah do we need? How much is required? And what about the image of standing on one foot? Well, the Hebrew word for leg here, regel, sounds like the Latin word regula, which means a basic principle or rule. And the audience for this piece of Agadah would have understood that because they understood Latin. They would have heard this as teach me the entire Torah in one basic principle. So we ask ourselves, is there a basic principle that undergirds the enormous diverse sea of learning and tradition that is Judaism? Regula can also mean measuring stick. How do we measure what is enough, what we need to learn? So what is it that our storyteller wants us to know? I think the storyteller wants us to know that there are no shortcuts here. We can't reduce the beauty and the depth and the complexity of our tradition to one idea. There's no way to avoid serious study. You know, we often hear the second part of Hillel's teaching in this piece of Agadah, the rest is commentary, as the rest is not important. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I think the storyteller is trying to tell us that both parts of Hillel's statement are of a piece. We cannot have one without the other. For the rabbis, commentary really was equal to the text, if not more important. They believed that there were no shortcuts to wisdom. The study of our sacred texts is critical to knowing what it is that God expects from us. Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, who was chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary from 1951 to 1972, famously said, "When I pray, I speak to God. When I study, God speaks to me." So my wish for all of us this Shavuot and always is that we let God speak to us as we open our hearts and our minds, as we study the beauty and the wisdom of Torah in all its complexity and all its beauty. I wish you all a Chag Sameach.
Thank you so much. We will take a short break of about 3 minutes and we'll be back on track at 8:20 p.m. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We will be starting again in 2 minutes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Ruth Friedman. I serve as the Maharat at Ohev Shalom, the National Synagogue in Washington, D.C., and it's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I think this wins for the least interactive shir that I have ever given. But what I wanted to do tonight is to look at one of the things I love most about the Torah is the way that you can learn it year after year, and then every time that you learn it, you find something new or you relate to it in a new way that you hadn't been able to before. And so a couple weeks ago, when we were reading the end of Vayikra, the end of Leviticus, I was remembering a text that I had studied a few times prior and realized, oh my gosh, this has such an interesting application to life during this pandemic. And so I just wanted to consider it for a moment. The beginning part is a bit technical. So we're going to be looking at the topic of Erchin, which is the last chapter in Vayikra and Leviticus, chapter 27, and says when a person wants to pledge the value of themselves, they take to vow the value of themselves to God, and there are questions of why would someone be doing that, but we don't have time for that now. Here are the rules of the numbers. In other words, like here are the way that you determine how much a person is valued. And I'm just going to walk through the numbers. Again, the point is not to remember each number. The point is to get the general trajectory of how the values increase and decrease, and I'll be more specific about that. So from 30 days to 5 years, that's age, a male is worth 5 shekel and a female is worth 3 shekel. From 6 years to 20 years, a male is worth 20 shekel and a female is worth 10 shekel. From 21 years to 60 years, a male is worth 50 shekel and a female is worth 30 shekel. And then from 61 years and up, a male is worth 15 shekel and a female is worth 10 shekel. So what we notice a couple of trends. First of all, men are in every single age category are always worth more than women. Now, you could say the more things change, the more they stay the same. But you could also say, well, men and their labor were valued more. Perhaps men performed more intensive labor that was harder to replace. We don't have to go into all of those details and all of those speculations, but the point to take from here is that men are always worth more than women, and that men also appreciate more than women. In other words, the ratio, so from age 30 days to 5 years, a female is worth 60% of a male. From 6 years to 20 years, she's worth 50%. So it's 60%, 50%. From 21 years to 60 years, she's back up to being worth 60% of the man. But from 61 years and up, she's worth exactly 2/3 or 66.6%. So what we notice is that she was always worth less, but for some reason, she depreciates the least in respect to him for the age category of 61 years and up. Now, this prompts questions from the commentators of why suddenly does a man depreciate? His value crashes from the 21 years to 60 years to 61 years and up, whereas her value decreases when jumping from that age category, but she doesn't depreciate at the same rate as the man does. And so we have to ask why. Now, the Chizkuni gives a very technical answer, and he says, well, the reason is that because men back then, their skills were more focused on hard labor. And so when they reached the age of 61 years and up, I guess they saw that as a hard transition to being less able-bodied. His strength, it weakens. And so he can't perform his labor the same way that he could, and therefore his value depreciates so greatly. However, women tend to have labor and skills that are less physically involved and less demanding and less difficult, and therefore when women age, our skill doesn't crash in value the same way because we're still able to do that same amount, well, not to do that same amount of work, but it's not, the difference is not so noticeable as we get older. So now what I wanted to do is just to look at Rashi. So that was the Chizkuni, more technical answer. Rashi also provides perhaps an ostensibly technical answer, and one that I always kind of chuckled on, but really have a renewed appreciation for this year. So Rashi says, why is it that the man depreciates more at a greater rate than the woman at this older age? And he quotes a Gemara. And the Gemara has a little phrase for us, and it's in Aramaic, but I'll just read the English. It doesn't click quite the same way, but you'll forgive me. So, because Chizkiah said that people say, there's a popular saying, if there's an elderly man in the home, there is a burden, a pacha in the home. Now this is the commentary within the Gemara, he does not help with anything. But if there's an elderly woman in the home, there's a treasure in the home, as she assists with various domestic labors. Now, those last comments about him not helping and her assisting is the commentary of the translator of the Gemara. So they're walking around with this ancient Babylonian saying that an older man in the home is a burden, but an older woman in the home is a treasure. Now, as the translation of the Gemara is assuming, that's because an older man doesn't help, right? Doesn't help with the household tasks, doesn't help with the children, the grandchildren, just doesn't help. And some people listening, I'm not sure who all of you are, but you may feel that you can identify with that, or you may feel that this is a totally generalized, unfair assumption. I think both would be accurate interpretations, but that a woman in the home, she's so helpful. She knows how to do all of these things, right? She can still cook. She can still help with the kids. She can still make sure things get cleaned, etc. And so she actually really, is actually quite valuable. And what really, I think, stood out to me this year more than anything else was that if you look at Rashi's commentary on the Gemara here, he looks at the word for treasure, that the older woman is a treasure in the home, and the word is sima in Aramaic, and he defines it as a matmun shechola litroch v'lasot melacha b'ziknuta, that let's say it's a treasure who can labor and do her work in her old age, kind of like we said, right? She can still contribute. But the word for treasure here is matmun, which comes from the word to hide, or it's hidden, right? Because a treasure is something that you maybe don't know it's there, you can't find it until you find it. And I really thought that this was a nice way of framing this conversation and thinking about all of these technicalities of numbers and values, and like, why are we guessing the value of ourselves? And it's just kind of strange and uncomfortable, and we don't like generalizing based on gender and based on age. These are ideas that are uncomfortable to us nowadays. And maybe weren't back then, or maybe were. But what is this message that we can distill from this kind of strange topic? I think here is that what Rashi is saying, when you translate treasure specifically as something that is hidden, I think what we're saying is it took the husband, the spouse of this woman, this elderly woman, it maybe even took her children, perhaps her grandchildren, her whole life to find that treasure within her, to find the parts of her that she really could contribute to society. She was walking around with that potential for all of her life. And now that she's reached a new point in her life, specifically one where she's relegated more to the home and isn't really going out, suddenly everyone has discovered that beauty about her, or that thing in her, as opposed to the man who's been working outside the home and working in hard labor for his whole life, and is now stuck at home and has lost all of his potential, has lost all of his way of contributing to society. And I thought, well, isn't that such an interesting and beautiful way of thinking about being this pandemic and being stuck at home? There are some people who have reacted, I'm sure many of us have reacted, by saying, wait, I'm stuck at home, but I'm used to going out. I'm used to doing this. I'm used to having meat and getting, coffee and work and all of this. Like I know how to exist outside my home, right? In relationship with other people. And yeah, that's how this man feels, right? But we could then find ourselves stuck at home, just like this older man is, and unable to contribute and to feeling lost. Or we can think of it more like this woman as well, and think, well, maybe we've been living our whole lives in one way, and now that we're at home, it's offered us an opportunity for new beginnings and new ways of growing and new ways of contributing to society. And that while this is a painful experience for so many of us, probably for all of us, in many different ways, that through that pain and through that struggle, there also can really be opportunities for growth as well. And so even though I don't know you, I really wish you, many, many days ahead of growth and of productivity.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Stephen Reen, Rabbi at Agudas Achim Congregation in Alexandria, Virginia. This week marks the 260th yahrzeit of Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the central figure of Hasidic Judaism, known throughout the Jewish world as the Baal Shem Tov, or the Besht. On the eve of Shavuot, the final night of his life, the Baal Shem Tov's students were gathered close to him as he taught about the giving of the Torah. In the morning, he requested them all that they all should gather, and he gave them instructions on how to care for him after his departure. Afterward, he instructed them to give him his prayer book, and he said, "I will now spend some time speaking with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is he." And from the Baal Shem Tov's chamber, his students heard him saying, "I concede these 2 hours to you. Do not bother me." They asked him with whom he was speaking, and he said to them, "Don't you see the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, that was always fleeing from me? And now that he has been given permission over me, his wings are spread, and it is a great joy for him." In other words, the Baal Shem Tov was aware that the angel of death was hovering over him, waiting for the decree from above that would give the angel permission to take his soul back to God. The Baal Shem Tov then offered his students a sign that when his soul would be released, the 2 clocks of the house would stop. He washed his hands and the big clock stopped, and the people turned it around so that it could not be seen. And he said to them, "I'm not worried about myself, because I know clearly that I will leave through this door and immediately enter through another door, the entrance of Olam Haba, the world to come." The Baal Shem Tov once again sat up on his bed and instructed his students to stand around him as he spoke words of Torah and said, "Now I finally know the purpose for which I was created." He instructed them to recite verses of Psalms as he lied down and sat up, directing his prayers towards God until they did not hear him articulating words any longer. He told them to cover him with a sheet, and he began to shake and tremble, and then he rested. They noticed that the small clock had stopped. They waited a few minutes, and then witnessed his soul depart. The day was Shavuot 5520, May 16th, 1760. If we can learn anything from these final hours of the great Hasidic master, it is to live in the moment, to fill all of our time on this earth with purpose, and to embrace death as a part of life. We all live in a democracy of time. Scholar or ignoramus, aristocrat or wage slave, everyone receives the same 168 hours a week. They are non-negotiable and, unlike some cell phone plans, definitely do not roll over if not used well. The English poet Samuel Johnson once said that nothing concentrates the mind of a condemned man like the sighting of a rope. Likewise, these days we are all thinking about our own finitude. As Franz Kafka once wrote, "The meaning of life is that it ends. Our time on earth is precious precisely because it is finite." Kafka's sober insight brings to light the most important message of the Yizkor liturgy that we'll recite later this week on Shavuot. The words of the psalmist, "Teach us to number our days, that we may attain a heart of wisdom." Time is the ultimate limited and non-reusable resource. Our prayers these days remind us to contemplate our own encounter with the angel of death. They also supply a reason to plan a better use of the time in between today and the journey to, as Shakespeare put it, the undiscovered country. If we reverse the psalmist's words, we learn not only to teach us to number our days, that we may attain a heart of wisdom, but We can find wisdom only if we learn that our days are numbered. To state it more simply, only when we take seriously the limited hours available to us each week can we make decisions on how we use our time with wisdom. If time is a precious resource, then, like any expensive commodity, it must be invested wisely. I've often thought that I would rather give a friend or family member my credit card than the password to my Outlook calendar. We can always settle up on the money borrowed, but time borrowed can never be repaid. As Horace Mann once wrote in the Lost and Found column of a newspaper, lost somewhere between sunrise and sunset, 2 golden hours, each set with 60 diamond minutes. No reward is offered, for they are gone forever. Some years ago, I learned a new medical term. I was told that a seriously ill congregant of mine was pre-terminal. Evidently, this means he was not yet terminal, but it was expected that soon he would be. Can't that really be said about each and every one of us? When it comes right down to it, aren't we all pre-terminal? We live as dying creatures. We are aware, to a greater and lesser extent, of the inevitability of our own mortality. Sometimes we push it aside. Sometimes it comes crashing in. We know that the clocks of our lives are ticking. Ultimately, this awareness should serve to focus our attention on living. It should make what is unimportant less important. We do not have time to waste, not on people we do not enjoy being with, and not on doing things that are not compelling or worthy. Our time is brief. And the Baal Shem Tov, at the hour of his death, turned to his students and said, "Now I finally know the purpose for which I was created." He was not encouraging morbidity. Rather, he was suggesting that only when we look back at the completion of our life will we really understand the meaning of everything that transpired previously. It means that we prepare for death by living well, by living in accordance with God's values, the values of our sacred tradition, and our own integrity, by living fully in each and every moment. The Baal Shem Tov, again as he was dying, turned to God and said, "I hereby pledge a gift to you of the remaining hours of my life." The Karatza Rebbe, one of his students, taught that this was a true act of Kiddush Hashem, or martyrdom. But we do not have to wait until our final hours to offer up the gift of our remaining time. It is never given to us to know whether we have several hours or weeks or months or years. But imagine how elevated our lives could be were we to pledge, "This time is no longer my time. It is my gift to God, and I will live my life in such a way that every moment is my gift to God. The way I treat the people I love, I will offer up as a gift. The way I work to build community, I offer God this gift to you. The way I work to strengthen Judaism and the Jewish people, the way I represent my love for Israel and for Zion everywhere I do these, God, I give to you. The way I care for your creation and walk lightly on your beautiful blue-green planet, this, God, I give to you as a gift. My remaining hours, I give to you." And this ought to be our pledge today, not only in memory of those we love, but more importantly, in honor of the living and with our hope for our future. So I'd like to wish everyone a Chag Sameach, a beautiful, meaningful Shavuot. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Avi Strasberg with Hadar in DC. It's a pleasure to be learning with you tonight. In this holiday that celebrates receiving the Torah, with all of God's mitzvot and halachot, the laws that we hold dear, I want to explore, is there ever a time in which we are in fact required to violate the very same Torah for the sake of God? And if there might be a time when we're required to violate the Torah for the sake of God, when might we be required to do so? And what would be the limits of that? And so it says in the book of Psalms, Et lasot laHashem hefiru Toratcha. It's a time to act for God because they have violated their Torah. This is normally understood to mean because there are people that have violated God's Torah, now it's my time to act for God. But we're going to see in a passage from Masechet Brachot that Rabbi Natan is going to take a totally radical meaning on this verse. He's going to turn this verse on its head. So we learn in Masechet Brachot that a person should ask after the peace, should ask after the well-being of their friend, and can do that using the name of God. And where do we learn that from? We learn that from none other than the book of Ruth, from Boaz, the book of Ruth that we read on Shavuot. So it says there, V'hine Boaz ba mi Beit Lechem vayomer lekotzrim Hashem imachem, that Boaz would come from Beit Lechem, and Boaz would say to the harvesters when he would see them, Hashem imachem, God is with you, using God's name to greet them. Vayomru lo, and they would say back to him, Yivarechecha Hashem, and may God bless you. And just as Boaz would greet them using God's name, so too they would greet Boaz using God's name. We might think that this seems like a wonderful practice, but in fact, this presents a major problem for the rabbis. What's the problem? We learn in the 10 Commandments, the same 10 Commandments that we receive on Shavuot, the second commandment is, do not take God's name in vain. And while we might not think that this is taking God's name in vain, just the very act of casually dropping God's name into speech to greet someone else is in fact a major violation of the second commandment. So how could it be? How could it be that we casually greet each other, that the rabbis say it's permissible to greet each other, to ask after one another's well-being using the name of God? Isn't this a violation of the Torah, a violation of the 10 Commandments? And here's where we get an answer in the Gemara. The Gemara says, it quotes back to us this verse from Psalms that I just shared with you. It says in Psalms, Et lasot laHashem hefiru Toratcha. It is a time to act to God because they have violated your Torah. But now Rabbi Natan is going to flip the verse on its head and reread it. Rabbi Natan says, read it differently. Switch the order. Hefiru Toratcha mishum et lasot laHashem. They violated your Torah. Why did they violate your Torah? Because it is a time to act for God. Rabbi Natan is suggesting that perhaps there are times when we are called to violate God's Torah because it is a time to act for God. So in this text, why is it okay to greet one another using God's name casually? Because that actually we're violating the Torah about not taking God's name in vain, because greeting one another with respect is a way of acting for God. There's a, Rashi says on this verse, let me just pull this up for you here. So Rashi says on this verse, Rashi says it's a time to act for God because they have violated your Torah. Rashi says, there are times when we actually nullify, when we cancel the words of Torah in order to act for God. He says it very clearly. And also this person who's wishing to ask after the well-being of his friend, this is actually the will of God, as it says in the Torah, that you should seek peace and you should chase after it. Umatar lehafir Torah v'lasot davar hanir'eh asur. And so therefore, because you are doing God's will, it is in fact permissible to violate Torah and to do this thing, hanir'eh asur, that seems to you forbidden. I think this line is really key, that there are times when we think that thing is forbidden. As far as I understand the Torah says I'm not allowed to do this, but in fact, that's just your understanding of it. Because sometimes in order to act for God, we are in fact required to violate the Torah. And this is not the only place. This isn't a one-time teaching. We don't see this just in this passage. In fact, this idea of violating God's Torah for the sake of acting for God comes up in other places. One of the other places we see it is in the Gemara in Tamora. There in the Gemara Torah, it's talking about whether or not one is able to write down the oral Torah. The idea there is you are not supposed to write down the oral Torah. Why? Because that sets it in stone. It makes it inflexible so that it can never change. And we want the oral Torah to stay vibrant and alive. But they ran into a problem because when they didn't write down the oral Torah, the rabbis were forgetting, chas v'shalom, God forbid, the rabbis were forgetting the Torah. And so what did they say? Even though it's forbidden, according to the Torah, to write down the oral Torah, they said we have to allow the oral Torah to be written. Why? Because it's a time to act for God, because sometimes acting for God means violating the Torah. So there in the Gemara, Tamora, it says, it quotes that same verse. It's a time to act for God. They have violated their Torah, meaning we violate the Torah in order to act for God. Amre mutav te'aker Torah ve'al tishtakach Torah misrael. It is better to uproot Torah. Such a strong phrase. It's better to uproot Torah so that Torah not be forgotten from Israel. This brief and radical teaching on what it means it's a time for act to God, it teaches us that sometimes we are in fact called to violate Torah, or what we perceive to be Torah, for the sake of acting for God. There's incredible potential and power in this, and of course it also brings great risk to Torah. When we think about this, there are a lot of questions we have to ask. Who gets to decide what it means to violate Torah? And when, in what circumstances do we decide that it's necessary to violate God's Torah? But there's also a calling here. We learn in the Gemara in Menachot, Bitula shel Torah zehu kiyuma. We learn that sometimes the nullification of Torah is its fulfillment. Just hear the power of that sometimes the nullification of Torah is its fulfillment. In order to fulfill the Torah, we in fact have to nullify Torah in some way. Because sometimes, for the sake of Torah, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of goodness, we may be required to act against Torah. And so my hope and my prayer for us as we go into this Shavuot, as we think about what it means to be a people of Torah, what it means to receive the Holy Torah with all of its teachings, my hope and prayer is that may we be sensitive enough, may we be careful enough, and may we also be responsive enough to Torah and to the world around us to know what is being asked of us and when. May we know when we're being required to act for Torah by preserving the Torah, and what it means to act for God may actually require us to take a closer look, to do the thing that seems in fact not permissible, and to violate Torah for the sake of fulfilling Torah. Chag Sameach. I hope it's a great Shavuot.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Abby Sharofsky. I am the Director of Intergroup Relations and Rabbi in Residence for the JCRC of Greater Washington. And I did start my video. Okay. All right. I'm the Director of Intergroup Relations for the JCRC of Greater Washington and the Rabbi in Residence. And today I would like to, first I'm thrilled to be here teaching with everyone. And I want to thank everyone who's been participating and realize I'm the last one to go on tonight. So I appreciate everyone that's hung in there this whole time, and I can't even begin to imagine the amazing Torah that you've learned. So I'd like to start by telling you a little story about a lecture that I participated in at Catholic University of America just this past fall. I was there as they're part of a panel with a Catholic priest in a undergraduate class that was talking about Jewish and Catholic interactions and what does it mean for how do these young Catholic students, young adults, understand Judaism. And we're having a conversation, and these young men and women, all undergraduates, are asking me, well, tell me about the law. And I'm trying to explain, well, there are some Jews that believe one thing, and there are some Jews that believe another, and I'm a rabbi, but there are Jews that wouldn't consider a woman to be a rabbi, and I'm explaining about the different movements. And one young woman raises her hand and said, Rabbi, I see what you're saying, and I've been listening to you this whole time, and I don't get it. You say there's some Jews who do one thing and some Jews who do Another thing, who's right? How does that work? And I said, well, there's this teaching, elu ve'elu, both these and those are the words of God. And she said, no, but really, which one is the right one? And at that point, I knew that I had to walk away. Okay, I'm seeing that the sound is poor. I put my mic. Okay. So I hope that the sound is a little better now. So I'm teaching, and I tell this young woman, no, I don't know how to tell you that there isn't a one right way or another way. And when I thought about that, and I thought about what does it mean for Jews to walk into interfaith dialogue and discussion, and that that one interaction, I think, sums up a lot of what I get to do. And I've been thinking about this text from the Talmud, from Eruvin 13b. The link is in the chat box, and I'll share the text. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. They said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion, and there are those that said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice, the Bat Kol, came out and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. However, the halakha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. So what does this mean? What does it mean that both these and those, elu ve'elu, that you have two or more valid points of view? What do we do with that? How do we live and exist and thrive in our Judaism, knowing that we have all of these opinions, and that in elu ve'elu, it is completely fine to learn Beit Shammai's teaching. It is based on Torah. Shammai simply came to a different conclusion about how to interpret it. The law is based on Hillel. And how does that relate to interfaith work? When engaging in interfaith dialogue, you are saying that you are prepared to enter a space in which two or more religious truths are valid, and you're there to be comfortable and confident in your own faith. It's a very vulnerable point, being able to walk into a space and know that there are people that hold their religious truths dear, and that you hold yours dear, and that knowing that you're not there to change each other's minds, you're there to exist with sometimes a discomfort that not everyone is right, or that not everyone is in the same space. They may be right to them, but it may not feel right to you. I've heard people talk about the strength they gain from their faith and the peace they feel in prayer. I've worked with people who identify as atheists and Zoroastrians and heard of practices and theologies that are beautiful and inspiring. And to be honest, some of them don't feel that far off from the Judaism that I know and love. So what is it about interfaith work that, rather than causing me to question my faith, rather it strengthens it? So for me, that strengthening piece is in that punchline. The halakha was based on Beit Hillel. Halakha, we think of it sometimes as law. What's the law? What's the halakha? But I'd like to look at it as literally meaning the way we go or the way we move. The Talmud here is not telling us to negate the beliefs of others, but to acknowledge another person's truth and go a different way. That Bat Kol, that heavenly voice that said elu ve'elu, still there, and it's always there, even today. I don't give up any of my faith or my identity as a Jewish person when I wish Muslims Eid Mubarak, or Christians Merry Christmas, or learn about Sikhism or Hinduism or Buddhism. In fact, seeing others strong in their faith reiterates two things for me. First, belief in something is important. Belief nourishes the soul. It gives a sense of purpose, and I feel gives a moral footing in what is a very precarious world. And Judaism. Judaism gives me belief and practice. Come back to that punchline from our text, that halakha. It tells me that the two must go hand in hand. The belief and the practices. And the practices are that way of life that Judaism establishes, that intensifies my belief. By being able to have both in tandem, I am strengthened and I am able to live my best Jewish self, especially while in conversation with people of other faiths. And that's why I do what I do. I love that I get to work with people of all faiths. I love that I get to exist constantly in the space of Elu ve'elu, that I get to do that with not only my peers and colleagues in other faith traditions, but my peers and colleagues within Judaism. I love that I get to be in a pluralistic space, that events like tonight are able to happen, where we can share Torah and hear Torah from so many different perspectives. And we can hear it from a range of religious beliefs, practices, ideas, and the text in Torah that was brought tonight is simply astounding. And so I offer this blessing as we approach Shavuot, as we approach this time of really looking at Torah, being in a space to receive Torah, whatever that may mean. And it could mean one thing to one person and one thing to another. And I offer that blessing that you may always be able to exist in that space of both these and those. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment also to commemorate Memorial Day and to honor our military personnel who lost their lives in service to our country. I'd also like to say thank you again to Rabbi Ori Topolowski for taking the lead on organizing this event, and to Mindy Berger, the Senior Manager for Engagement at Federation, for all the behind the scenes work she did to make this possible. It would not have happened without you. To all the rabbis who came together tonight for an evening of learning, to all of you for joining us as a community, to the Federation for hosting this event, and to our co-sponsors at the JCRC, the Washington Board of Rabbis, and Hadar. Thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.